Katherine Mangu-Ward, welcome to Dad Saves America.
I'm thrilled to be here.
So somehow we have circled each other for like 15 plus years and never actually, I don't think, had a conversation. So I'm really excited about this. You have written things that I'm sympathetic to, but will sound utterly radical to most people, which is don't vote, and that none of us should vote. P.J. O'Rourke had a book, I think the cover of which was, don't vote, you just encourage the bastards. So
Yes.
make your case.
So I will say my case is, I think there are people who kind of take the cynical PJ O'Rourke stance, and I get that. My case is less cynical and more kind of like cheerfully nihilistic, maybe, because I think what I'm trying to do is just help make sure people understand what it is that their vote can and can't do. So I should start by saying I'm a political journalist, right? Like, I think being involved in politics and being involved in civic life and being involved in elections is interesting and fun and sometimes even good. So I don't want people to conflate don't vote with don't care about politics at all. I think you can make the case for that too, but it's not the same thing. And then I think, there's kind of a few different arguments. One is just mathematical. Like, even people who kind of fundamentally know the math, they kind of want to believe that their vote could be the one that decides the election. Any election, but certainly national elections, it's not going to. Your vote just simply, there are very, 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 very few elections that are decided by a single vote or even a handful of votes. We have a lot of gerrymandering and kind of gamesmanship in this country. And so districts are built around clustering together like-minded voters. But even if we didn't, still, it's a large country, it's a large electorate. Your one vote probably isn't going to be the deciding factor. However, you can decide whether or not you're going to be part of a group, right? So am I going to be part of the group of people that voted for this guy or that guy? If you think both the guys are bad, which an awful lot of people do always, but maybe especially in this cycle, you don't have to be a part of the group that supports them. You can simply choose not to. And I think that that's actually can be morally defensible, maybe even more morally defensible than voting for either character in many cases. The kind of very edgelordy analogy is to say, if you see a firing squad and they're about to shoot someone, and you walk up and pick up a gun and join the firing squad, and everyone shoots at the same time, it probably wasn't your gun that killed the guy. But why did you join the firing squad? Like, why not do it? I said edgelordy, right? It's a little bit of a ridiculous example, but
mob rule. Democracy is often two wolves and a sheep trying to decide who's gonna be dinner.
Sure, absolutely. And then I think the other thing is, sometimes people will say, well, if you don't vote, you can't complain. Your right to complain is sacred. Your right to complain is prior to whether or not you exercise your privilege of voting. Your right to complain is the core of what it means to be American, especially to complain about politicians, right? Like, the thing the First Amendment protects is your right to complain about the government, first and foremost. And it doesn't matter if you vote or don't vote. You absolutely can complain. Sometimes there's kind of a trap where it's like, well, if you don't participate in the election, you can't complain. But if you do participate in the election, you consented. Like, both of those things can't be true. You have to be able to have input on politics regardless. So in the end, I think for most people, most of the time, you're better off not voting. I do make kind of an exception when I make this argument, and I say, listen, if we're talking about a PTA election and there's only going to be one voter and it's going to be you, feel free. If you think you can actually decide the election and you actually know who the best candidate is, go ahead. But when we're talking about kind of mass get out the vote campaigns to encourage low information voters to show up, I don't actually think those are a social good.
All right, I'll keep this quick. If you like what you're hearing and want to hear more, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss our new content as it comes out every week. And now, back to the conversation. So, I think it's pretty easy to explain that even in Bush v. Gore in 2000 that went down to like the hanging chads in Florida. It was still something like 530 something votes. So
Right.
even if you were in Florida in 2000 voting, your vote didn't technically make the difference. But is this a fallacy of composition? Which is to say, well, just because one piece of the puzzle doesn't matter, that doesn't actually scale if those of us that care about individual liberty, freedom, free markets, capitalism, human progress, innovation, technology, if we opt out, won't the whole world look like the university system where basically like the radical Marxist lunatics just take the whole thing over and we're left in our corner with an ever shrinking number of toys to play with?
So, I mean, it is a fair question to say, hey, Catherine, you argue for not voting, but, there's a certain subset of people who might be listening to you or persuaded by your arguments. And so are you kind of throwing things out of balance in that way? I think that's a fair enough criticism. I would like to think that my arguments reach people who would vote both directions. And so at the very least, I'm just kind of, you know, canceling out, right? That hopefully I'm convincing some Democrats and some Republicans not to vote. And my influence doesn't matter electorally. I will say also though, like I'm not a Kantian, right? Like I think a lot of the time, these type of arguments rest on a kind of intuitive understanding of the categorical imperative, right? This idea that, you should make moral principles that are universalizable. That if it's right for you to do it, it's right for everyone to do it, and vice versa. I actually don't think that's a great way to make moral principles. And so I think you can say, given the world as it is, which direction should we be headed? And I think the answer is probably more people shouldn't vote. I also, I will say there's a lot of, I don't know if you've heard this term, the double haters, right?
Yeah.
The none of the above voters. This is the thing. This is the double haters election. So I do feel like, oh, those are my people, like the double haters, and they're right to hate these candidates. Like I really can't say that enough. In the case of the presidential election, the two top of the ticket major party guys just are really quite terrible. And expressing that is not unpatriotic or failing in your civic duty. It would be great if we had an electoral system where you could express that formally at the polls, right? And this is why libertarians so often get excited about stuff like ranked choice voting or approve, disapprove, or all these kind of different ways to do a ballot. I love listening to those arguments. I think it's a cool intellectual exercise. I'm not super optimistic that we're going to end up reforming our elections in a broad-based way to incorporate an option that allows people to express dissatisfaction with the candidates because, among other things, the major parties have kind of a chokehold on the ballot access and election logistics process.
As a political journalist, and I want to dig deeper into the basics of the philosophy together, but in our moment right now, as a political journalist, at the head of a really major magazine, it does feel like we're in especially weird times.
I think it's I've been taking a lot of solace in thinking about and reading about the early 70s lately. This is before my birth, but my understanding is that it really puts 2024 in perspective to think about 1972, in which America was behaving in an utterly bonkers way from top to bottom. Um, we're talking about like Nixon pursuing Timothy Leary across the globe. We're talking about riots. We're talking about just like casual hijackings of airplanes every Tuesday. We're talking about a very, very broken and dysfunctional political process in which assassinations are kind of on people's minds and in a way that's we can't even imagine now. So I guess all that is to say, for those of you who lived through the early 70s, like, tell me if I'm wrong, but it seems to me like that might have been a crazier time. And I, for one, just like find peace in that. Like America has been crazier and we will be crazier again and it's going to be fine.
I mean, it's interesting they bring up 72 because one of the things that was kind of striking is that 2020 has so many eerie parallels to 1968 that I don't know if it was Hegel or Marx that said, history repeats first as comedy and then as farce, or first as tragedy and then as farce. I mean, we definitely are in the farce repetition. That's for sure, right? It's like, so 68, we got a Asian flu, race riots, radicalism on college campuses. We had all the things. We had all the things, and then 2020 comes along, and it's basically like, I mean, I forget, one politician called it the summer of love in 2020. So, uh, do you think 2020 and the combo of COVID plus the George Floyd riots against the backdrop of the election, that we're still very much in like the swirl of that vortex? It was a big deal of a year. It's a crazy year.
Yeah, I mean, I do think, this is, as always, the years that we point to as these kind of landmark years are the culmination of trends that were happening long before them, right? I mean, that's obvious. And so when I think about what happened in 2020, I think a lot about something that my colleague at Reason, Nick Gillespie, was writing about for many years before that, which is the decline in trust in institutions, these sort of accelerating um, polling data and other kind of approval metrics, that kind of thing, showing that people not only didn't trust any particular institution that they were being asked about, but just
Yeah.
overall, not just governmental, but also private, a decline in trust in institutions. And then you see right around 2020, this huge uptick in people telling pollsters about affective polarization, right? So they believe that the other side is evil. Is a totally unscientific way of describing affective polarization,
Sure.
but that they have this sort of sense that the other team, however constituted, has already broken the rules. They've already violated the norms, and so they in turn are justified in violating those norms. And those numbers just go crazy during that 2020 period, but they were already trending that way. And so I think that one thing that we're seeing that does mirror some of the late 60s and early 70s is people either losing their trust in institutions or simply being willing to say out loud that they don't trust those institutions. Because I do think those can be two different things. Um, People don't trust Congress. People don't trust the president. People don't trust the Supreme Court. People don't trust the media. People don't trust, colleges and universities. It, it's not great. So I think from that perspective, a lot of the dysfunction of our current moment, yes, is kind of brought to a head in 2020, but it's all part of trends that were already there.
I early couple years back, I fell in love with Martin Gurry's book, The Revolt of the Public, which talks a lot about, and it was published in 2014, which is interesting, but about how essentially the internet and the tsunami of information, as he put it, is what has given rise to this institutional collapse of trust. Because, well, frankly, we just get to see how corrupt everybody is. It's like, you could have horrible stuff being done by the CIA halfway around the world and wouldn't know about it. And now you get pictures out of Abu Ghraib, or you watch what happened with the pullout of Afghanistan in real time. So you're watching this stuff and you're like, we are being ruled by morons, by like morons and liars. And it's like, that seems to be like a statement of fact. Which, so is it that the collapse in trust is bad because we need trust? Is it the collapse in trust is good because at least now we're getting an honest look at the way things really are? Are both of those things true? Is there a path through those choppy waters? How do you think about that?
Yeah, I think the problem is that both of those things are true. That's exactly right. Because of course, we don't want high levels of public trust at the expense of truth, right? We don't want three channels, all of which are basically in bed with the government, and that's the way it is. All the news that's fit to print, nothing to see here. That's not right. That can't be what we want. On the other hand, when people learn about corruption, when they learn about incompetence, it seems like even when they learn about corruption and incompetence within the state, they call for more state action.
Mm-hmm.
And this is something that's like very peculiar to human psychology. It seems fairly universal. You can see this in countries where where there's much, much higher civil disorder, and is often very clearly caused by either corrupt people in power or just a general low functioning, low competence in the government. And still, people want more rules, more regulations, more law and order. I mean, I think we're seeing that really in the sort of 2020, 2021, 2022 narrative about kind of disorder in American cities. Like, why was there disorder in American cities? Mostly because of stuff the government did, right? If you
Right.
clear a bunch of people out of the streets, and also if you, um, sort of give cops an impossible job, if you ask them to enforce all kinds of laws that shouldn't exist on the books in the first place, you're going to get a situation where, yeah, maybe there is going to be an increase in disorder. The response in so many cases, including, I will say, among people who identify as libertarian, or at least are kind of appropriately skeptical of the cops in other contexts, the call was more policing, more law and order. And I think that you can see it on the micro and the macro scale. So I think that the way out is really hard. Like the stupidly obvious yet impossible way out is like, well, what if we had a competent, high functioning state that performed a limited set of roles and responsibilities well? A crazy idea. Unfortunately, like getting there is easy to say, hard to do.
So let's build the basics of what constitutes your libertarianism. Where would be the best place to start? I would assume it's the individual. So how do you conceive of what the individual is and what individualism is?
So that's certainly where I started biographically. So we can start there as well, which is to say, I was a teenage objectivist. I read Ayn Rand when I was 15. And I was like, this is incredible, right into my veins. Let's do it. Um, you can imagine I was like very unpleasant that summer, but ultimately, it was for me just a very eye-opening, it was kind of my first contact with not only just thinking about philosophy and economics and so many other things, but also obviously she is an individualist, right? That's, to me, that's the part of Rand that really has the most staying power, and I think has had the most impact on kind of American politics, is her um her use of the individual as the sort of fundamental unit. And that has stayed with me. I do not think of myself as an objectivist now, but I went to college. I read some more books. I read just like a few more books, and I was like, oh, maybe Ayn Rand doesn't have the first and the last word to say on all subjects. But I think anchoring yourself in individualism does a bunch of things, including promotes a real kind of egalitarianism. And I think that so often libertarians kind of eschew that word. They don't like to talk about equality. They like to talk about liberty. But I think for an individualist, they're the same thing, because it's,
Yeah.
conceiving of individuals as having equal dignity, equal value, and sort of building a society around that concept. To me, it's very powerful.
I want to come back to how you think about the source of that equal dignity, but that will bring up religion, which I want to save for later. But okay, so leaving aside notions of a soul and things like that, why is individualism? Why is thinking of the individual as the measuring stick? Why does that matter? What is it? I mean, we're social creatures, aren't we? So isn't that just selfishness? Isn't that just putting yourself above other things that might be just as important or more important, like your community or your family or your country? Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. These are these slogans we have, right? So dig deeper into why the individual as the agent resonates with you.
So I think there's a couple reasons. One is it seems to be a way of thinking that's the least subject to exactly that kind of sloganeering and potential abuse. There is, of course, we are social creatures. Human nature is a relevant question when you're talking about the individual, for sure. Um, but I think that if you tried to make a fundamental unit something that is larger than the individual, you immediately get into a place of justifying coercion. And so I think, that's the thing that I want to be vigilant for. In general, my libertarianism is kind of directional rather than utopian, and I think that's true for a lot of libertarians. So I would just say, I maybe can't tell you exactly what the world would look like, a truly individualistic, radically individualistic world would look like. But I can tell you that we're too far from it in one direction. And so I know which way I want to go. And that's more toward centering the individual, both in our politics and, in law, as well as in culture. And, I think we can talk about kind of thick versus thin libertarianism, or however the kids are calling it these days. But, to me, centering on the individual preempts a lot of arguments that get you straight into a place of, okay, maybe the fundamental unit is the family. Whose needs are we subordinating and who decides? Maybe the fundamental unit is the community. Whose needs are we subordinating and who decides? Maybe it's the city, the state, the government, the world. I don't think individualism denies that you might make compromises to live with other people, but it at least asks the question, what compromises do you consent to?
Yeah, that notion of consent feels like the next piece of the puzzle, and you use the term coercion, right? So how do you think about what is and is not coercion? There's this notion of the non-aggression principle, that I should be free to do more or less whatever I want so long as I don't hurt someone else. Of course, what constitutes hurt these days can include saying nothing or saying something. Like speech is violence, but also silence is violence, neither of which seem like are violence definitionally. So what does coercion and consent mean to you today?
So I recently went to a conference on the 50th anniversary of Anarchy, State, and Utopia. And I think that Robert Nozick's answer to that question is very instructive and also very deeply embedded in American libertarianism, right? So one way to parse the question of kind of consent versus coercion is just to say, this is a question about the proper scope of the state, right? So if the state is kind of a Weberian monopoly on violence, or just the entity that is coercing people in a society, well, how can we limit that? How can we constrain it? How can we kind of minimize the coercion that people experience? If you think of it as like, well, of course we're going to have influence on each other regardless. Like I could say something and that would make you feel sad. Maybe I already have in this conversation. Did I coerce you? Like I would say probably not. And so establishing those definitions is important. But I think if you kind of start with the individual, then what you're saying is like, okay, well, there are going to be cases where I might be forced to do something I don't want to do. But what is the distinction between, coercion and just having to choose between a variety of goods? And I think if the individual makes that choice, then we can at least say, well, we know the process was good here. And maybe it takes you to a bunch of different outcomes where people's choices end up constrained. But if we ask the question about consent, that helps us answer the question of the justice of the outcome, because it's a good process. I think there are lots of different places that Nozick takes this, including to some very fanciful portraits of utopia, which can be very interesting to think and talk about, especially when you think about online communities and a bunch of things that he couldn't have known about or seen 50 years ago. But that's where I would start.
It is very interesting when you think about the mechanism of choosing, and the sense in which I haven't really encountered a definition of moral action that can be coerced. Like if I'm going to judge, even in like a storytelling sense, right? Like we watch movies and we try to decide who's the good guy or the bad guy. And so much of that boils down to, do I understand the motivations behind the choice? And I think we all know that if somebody's pointing a gun to your head, literally or even figuratively, your choice is sort of compromised. It's not really your choice anymore, so you can't be held morally responsible for it. I feel like that's a pretty broadly understood sort of moral axiom, but it breaks down so quickly in discussions of what's right or wrong in justice in politics. It's like that goes out the window almost immediately. Like, oh, well, it quickly becomes, it seems like, well, I'm a good person, but my neighbor sucks. So I have to tell my neighbor what to do because they suck and I'm great. Is that, do you think that that sort of bad neighbor policy is a lot of what drives our politics?
I do, and I think it's interesting because there have been periods when that intuition was less dominant. So I'm thinking of a couple things here. One is, when I did get to college, a bright and bushy-tailed objectivist. Some of the folks that I met there had been kind of raised up in the Frank Meyer kind of fusionist tradition, which is often misunderstood to be a kind of uneasy alliance between traditionalist conservatives and libertarians. Sometimes people say, oh, it came out of the Cold War, when they were sort of had this shared enemy of communism. My colleague Stephanie Slade is actually working on a book right now that looks to kind of recontextualize the idea of fusionism and say, no, what fusionism always was the idea that virtue and liberty have to go together, that you cannot be coerced to be virtuous. And that, I think, more controversially for me, a little more difficult for me, is the idea that, in order for a society to be free, it has to be virtuous. It has to be composed of virtuous people, in ways um, that are sometimes, cultural in nature. And so I think this idea of, well, I tried to convince the other people who live around me, my bad neighbors, to agree with me, and then when they didn't, I was justified in using force. I was justified in coercing them to be virtuous. I'm going to force them to be good. And I think this understanding of fusionism is right, that's incoherent. You actually can't force someone to be good any more than you can force someone to be bad, in the sense of being kind of morally blameworthy. Um, and it's just so important to keep in mind that those two things do go hand in hand. I think that tradition was more present, especially in American conservatism, in the kind of, mid to late 20th century. And we are rapidly losing even the veneer of that, especially again in the sort of current Republican Party, where we've got the horseshoe theory of um, both conservatives and progressives saying, well, we have no choice but to use the power of the state to force you to do what I want. Sorry.
I think this is actually a pretty good place to bring some things in that um, I'm frankly most excited to talk to you about, because there's some stuff that's fun to talk about from a like first principles basis about economic liberty, capitalism, emergent order. I do want to talk about that stuff. But one of the things for me, because I came into the movement through Ron Paul and Hayek, and then so Hayek, emergent order, super philosophical way of thinking about things. What has happened to me personally in the past couple years, and I'm grappling with it, is the sense in which I don't even know quite how to put this, but that the virtue piece of that equation, I'd either taken it for granted or hadn't really thought that much about it. And it feels like it's collapsing in our society in different ways that make liberty seem harder to get to or to have, that the virtue foundation hasn't really been attended to by the people that I find myself philosophically most aligned with, like libertarian minded people. It's like, no, just do whatever you want. It's, you're not, as long as you don't punch me in the face, we're good. But you just said that you struggle with that a little bit. So what did you mean there? I want to hear where that struggle is for you, and then let's explore it together.
Yeah, I think we might be in kind of a similar place. I might be in a little more of an optimistic variant of it, but we'll see. So I think the question is basically, can you substitute other things besides kind of traditional, Judeo-Christian morality for the virtue piece and still have it work? So, for instance, could you have a virtuously objectivist society and have this equation work where we have liberty and virtue balancing each other out and working together? Could you have a utilitarian conception or a consequentialist conception of virtue? Usually, consequentialists don't use that word, but right action, let's say, that you kind of plug into that equation and have it work. I think you probably can, and I think that there will be growing pains, and I think that that's what we're experiencing. So I definitely have been really excited to see kind of this growth of like the progress movement, like people who are looking at the kind of abundance and not just material wealth, but also kind of the moral improvements that have attended the last, say, 200 years, but maybe also especially the last 80 or so years, thanks to capitalism, but also thanks to the kind of dramatically increased communications that we have with other people around the world. Um, I think it can be easy to lose sight of the fact that a period that you and I might say, oh, well, they have this kind of traditional conception of virtue. Maybe it's the 1950s, maybe it's whatever. And sure, it's not perfect, but that's the kind of thing that you need to balance out the licentiousness and liberty. That period was also a period when people just like casually punched their wives in the head sometimes, and which people were very, very racist, in which people were, often very indifferent to the suffering of others that didn't share their kind of tribal or national affiliation. And I think as a people, and certainly as a country, we are more virtuous in those ways than we were in that period. And so I think the question is that kind of virtue, that kind of cosmopolitan virtue, or maybe even something that verges toward a more consequentialist or utilitarian virtue, is that enough to still counterbalance the equation? Does that, if you're counting utils, does that protect liberty? Like, does that work? And I think it can, but I think the system will need tweaking, and we are in the middle of tweaking it. And frankly, maybe it's not going super well. I don't think it's an impossible task, but it might not be one we're succeeding at right now.
This is fun because I think I am open to the potential that your optimism can be warranted. My intuition is that no, it cannot. and so the thing I've always struggled with in grappling with this notion of utilitarianism, like, well, whatever is good for the greatest many is therefore good, is, well, we can't measure that. So it's sort of weird. It's like a philosophy that says maximize utility for the most people. And when asked, well, how will I measure this, since this is sort of an empirical assertion that, well, whatever's been good for the most people is good, and you can't measure it. So what are we even doing here? Like, I can't measure a util. That's not a thing that exists. It's what is good is also personally quite subjective. So how have you grappled with that? Because it seems like, other than like as a really low resolution, blur your eyes was that evil. Yeah, okay, utility. Don't like kill babies. That's horrible. Mass murder's bad. Maybe self-defense is acceptable, right? But that seems like about the resolution that utilitarian philosophy gets you. And then all the more like nuanced stuff is like, I don't know. It's all in the margin of util error. Am I being too hard on John Stuart Mill here, or what?
First of all, you can never be too hard on John Stuart Mill. He can take it. He's tough and he's dead. But I think that you can fundamentally make the same criticism of various deontological worldviews. And so that's kind of the place I would go first, is to say, like, well, I could do the same characterization you just did and say, like, yeah, we know there are rights. Like, people have rights, but like, what's the exact list of rights? Like, it's a little tricky. I feel like I know that it's bad to kill you or whatever, but like after that, it gets blurry. It's a kind of like, are the rights in the room with us right now? I mean, there's kind of like there's the same criticism of like, at the end of the day, you are basing your philosophy on something that there is going to be disagreement about what it looks like when you try to operationalize it. And the same could be said of kind of traditional virtue ethics, right? Like, okay, well, we know there's good behavior and bad behavior, virtuous and unvirtuous. What are the virtues and what are their priority? And you can certainly look at the ancients who prioritized, courage or virtue in battle over perhaps what you might think of as the bourgeois virtues, right? This is the kind of Deidre McCloskey approach. How do we rank order those? How do we think about how to build a society around privileging them? So I think any philosophy is kind of going to have this what do you do when the rubber meets the road problem. And to me, the kind of value of a more consequentialist approach is it doesn't take you as often to a place where you can kind of say, we expect people to do things that are against their natures. We expect people to do things that are going to be counterintuitive to them. And it also doesn't take you to the place where you're willing to, again, violate kind of consent or voluntarism in ways that I think is important to preserve. But, I ultimately I come down on the consequentialist side. I do not come down on the more kind of deontological side. But I think also we agree more than we disagree on a lot of things, especially in the libertarian space. So, you can call it rights or you can call it the conditions that promote human flourishing, but you can get to something that looks awfully similar if you are working with the same inputs and with goodwill, I think.
It's one of those interesting things that I think this is where my most traditional impulses have resurfaced most recently, which is I just find myself being more interested in the faith of my upbringing, which is Catholicism, which at a certain level is like the least libertarian of the religious. It's like, oh, there's one boss on the planet, and it's the Pope. So, and the thing I find interesting about faith in this way, at least my faith, as much as I don't know that much about it ultimately, it's all concerned with essentially the transcendental. I think I think properly understood. Like, it's like you've got the 10 Commandments, but most of it's just like, well, our dignity that you referenced is a function of our human nature as having a soul. Now, maybe you say, well, you're using the word soul, but you could use other words. You could think of it in a different way. But there is this like root of, well, our equality of dignity has a basis. It either has a basis or for me, it's hard to find the basis absent that. So what is that basis for human dignity? Like inequality of dignity in some basic way that, oh, we are equal, even though materially nobody's equal. Nobody's equally talented, equally smart, equally good looking. Some people are more inclined towards violence than others. Like, equality is not something that an alien that would observe humanity would arrive at as some kind of like alien anthropologist. It's like, oh, there's a kind of common human equality. They'd be like, no, this is a bunch of crazy people that are all over the map, and some of them get wildly rich, and some of them kill millions of people. This is equality isn't in the equation there, observationally.
So, I mean, I came from a very different place than you did. I was raised nothing, right? Like I was raised sort of my family kind of casually referred to churchgoers as cultists, but like not in an angry way, just in kind of like a it's not us way. And so I do think that has really influenced my worldview, of course. It also means that I don't come to the conversation with something to kind of struggle with or against in this way that you're describing. Um, for me, I think there are lots of different ways that you can get to insights that are often attributed to various religions, right? So um, there are many, many philosophical and faith traditions where there's some understanding of, appreciation of, attempt to quantify or qualify transcendence. And this includes kind of the strictest utilitarians who will say, well, we we're struggling with the kind of intricacies of it. We're struggling with the edge cases. But what an awful lot of libertarians or of a lot of utilitarians will say is, well, we know that like there is good, like life and happiness in some sense are good in this world. And they kind of still have this deep intuition. Um, I think that there are many ways to get to that insight. And I think we probably overvalue the traditional ways. And this gets us back to our question about, is there a kind of decaying virtuous or moral center in our society? I think it's quite clear from polling, especially about kind of mainline Protestants, people don't identify as religious in anything like the ways that they used to.
That's right.
That path to values is closing off. But I find it impossible to believe that humans no longer yearn for transcendence or no longer are looking for ways to make meaning out of their lives. I think we can talk a little bit about how sometimes they look to politics to make that meaning, and that's
Well,
probably not an optimal path. But I think for every person like that, you're also going to get someone who, wants to figure out a way to give money to charity, who's completely secular, but just wants to, limit suffering in the world, or who's going to go, even people who are doing a sit-in on a campus for the stupidest or most virtuous reason you can imagine. They're seeking meaning. They're looking for transcendence. Reason covers psychedelics quite a bit, and that's another path that people are taking to try to understand, why the world is the way it is and how to order it. So I think that, again, I have this kind of optimism that our brains are very, very adaptable. Like, that's the whole thing about humans, right? Is that we have these like Swiss Army knife brains. And I don't think that the end of one path to kind of making meaning means that we give up on that.
yeah, I think that the thing that's been probably the most challenging for my optimism on that front, and it isn't dead, it's just dinged. Uh, faith aside, is my faith aside, I should say, is that it sure looks like, and I don't know if this is even can be proven to be sound. It's just something a lot of people observe that seem pretty smart, which is the other like the God-shaped hole in people's hearts seems to get filled with a whole lot of nonsense that's way worse, like communism and like identity politics and like radical sort of anti-human environmentalism that's essentially kind of like a Gaia worship Rousseau 3.0. And you look at sort of where you know Gen Z polls are. It's like, how could we be in 2024 and have over close to 30% of Gen Zers say they have a favorable view of communism, the most murderous ideology of the 20th century? It if that's not what is that indicting? Because it's indicting probably a lot of things. So how do you think about those pieces of the puzzle? And I'll layer one more thing on just to make it a completely overwrought question. The collapse in mental health in this same group is also alarming to me. It's a part of why we started this channel in the first place. I talk to psychologists a lot. I'm really worried about our kids' mental health. And it's weird that we're wealthier than we've ever been. And it seems like the happiness and the mental stability is declining. So how do you think about all of that? Here's a cat. Catch it. Catch it from across the room.
I think the only possible way to approach that question is to just go straight to the Nietzsche. So that's what I'm going to do.
Okay.
Because I was looking up, that quote about, God is dead. We have killed him, you and I, right? I needed the quote for something. And for the first time, I think since college, I kind of like kept reading in the passage. And one thing that I noticed is that there's actually this very cool, it's Nietzsche. He's pretty good at this kind of let me pack 18 thoughts into 18 words thing. And one thing that he says in that passage is, how great must we be to have killed him? We must we must strive to become even greater to be worthy of having done this incredible act. I'm paraphrasing horrifically. But it reminded me of that, the quote from Stuart Brand, right? Sort of, this is the Whole Earth Catalog guy who's the dirtiest of hippies. And, his, actually he was like kind of a clean hippie, I guess, because it's sort of
He's like a
technology,
pro-nuclear
kind of,
hippie now, so he's
he's like
not.
a, yeah, he's like a
Yeah,
technology hippie, but
yeah.
he has this great quote, like, we are as gods, we might as well get good at it. And it's Nietzsche. It's the same thing, right? It's the same idea of like, okay, we've killed God, and once you've done that, you really can't go back, right? I think like there's no point in yearning for the lost thing. But here we are, godlike creatures, humans, like, we must be worthy of this world that we live in. And I think that that's, certainly in Brand's casting of it, it's very optimistic. It's like, hey, if we're going to be gods, we might as well be good at it. And I think that means a lot of things, but it means sort of competence. It also means benevolence. How do we think about our responsibility for ourselves and each other in a world where we have dominion? And I think that's I think there are lots of really, really, really smart and really, really well-intentioned people who are trying really hard to answer that question right now. And I think there's a lot of interesting new philosophical and kind of political movements coming out of that, including people like the effective altruists and the long-termists and all of these things. Like, there are people who are really trying to answer that question. I don't know if they have the right answers. Certainly the effective altruists have been through it the last couple of years, with the Sam Bankman-Fried scandals and all that. But I think it is a credit to us as a species that we really do keep trying to answer that question, even as we pull our past wrong answers out from under ourselves. And I do ultimately think, oh, there's a God and he has endowed us with certain rights is the wrong answer. That is not an answer that is persuasive to me, and it is decreasingly persuasive to others. Doesn't mean there isn't an answer.
I think you touch on a thing that is really important and is almost in some sense it's in tension with what you were just describing. I would argue, but that is the limits of our knowledge. So one of the ways I think about this philosophy is rooted in ignorance and ultimately in humility, in the sense in which whatever godlike capabilities we have, they are not omniscient and omnipresence. We don't have those two. So talk to me about how you understand those ideas and how they inform the other implications of individualism, like free enterprise.
I think the answer probably resides in the we in the Stuart Brand quote, right? It's pluralist. And so, for me, yes, one of the main reasons that I am a libertarian and that I think, the kind of insights of Hayek and others in his tradition, that, you know, knowledge is local and that it's, you can be aggregated by prices and other mechanisms, but that, a central decision maker will always be less good than action by the many. I think that's, so important, so horrifically overlooked everywhere in our society. I think that, in the end, the reason that I favor those things and the reason that I like capitalism is because of the way that it facilitates pluralism and experimentation, right? And so for me, it's like, well, we don't know. You're right. We're not omniscient. We're not omnipresent, but we don't have to know if we're just trying a lot of things all the time. And I think that's kind of the place I would take it, is like, we are as God. We are all. And we have to do our best for each other and for society, but we ultimately have to do it as individuals and not force others into our master plan, because that's how you get in trouble. And if people want to come along with my utopian adventure, they're welcome to join me. If they want me to help me build my, like, what did Stuart Brand have, the geodesic domes. If you want to help me build my geodesic domes, or like live out on an oil platform in my seastead or whatever it is, great. If you want to come along voluntarily, great. It might not be the answer, but it's a thing we can try. And I think that's one thing that I do like about the more kind of humble or like modest aspects of kind of libertarian insights on the world is, well, you could just try stuff. And it's okay if it feels wasteful, because the insight is like that waste isn't really a waste. That failures are information too. Failures are successes in that sense. Failures in the market are successes. And that's so counterintuitive. And you still have Bernie Sanders saying, why do we need 27 kinds of deodorant? Like, that's wasteful. No, like we got to try all 27 kinds of deodorant to figure out which one is going to work. And it might be that there are 27 different types of deodorant users and they all need their own kind, and that's fine. So I think that the understanding that what looks like waste is not waste, it's learning, is really, really central to what a libertarian world ends up looking like.
So how would you define, for someone who's at best got a cartoon version of this word in their head, capitalism? Like, what is capitalism as a system? And go hog wild with the different components from your perspective. But like, that word is that it was obvious. It was a critical word, right? I think Marx is the one that coins laissez-faire as capitalism or something. But what do you mean when you say, I love capitalism?
So I really like Deidre McCloskey's proposed alternative to capitalism, which is exchange-tested betterment. It's not going to sweep the nation as the word that we replaced capitalism with. But she is right that capital is only part of the story, right? So the accumulation of capital is, the place that word starts. And it is important. I think, often we actually overlook it nowadays because it is so easy to accumulate capital and to use it in flexible and kind of innovative ways. And that wasn't always the case for humanity. But to me, the heart of capitalism is the double thank you. So the idea that, like, I go buy an ice cream and you give me the ice cream and I give you the money and you say thank you and I say thank you. It's not zero sum. We both got what we wanted. And I think, at that very, very, very basic level, that's a thing that everyone knows and likes and understands. And so to me, that's where you should center any kind of conversation about capitalism, is it's mutually agreed upon trade.
Mm-hmm.
There's also kind of the system of global capitalism, right? Which, at Reason, we sometimes talk about the free movement of people, goods, and ideas across borders. And I think that, understood most broadly, is also just a great way to describe the thing that I want to see more of always, right? And the border can be the border from my private property to your private property. It can be the border from my nation to your nation. It can be, tribal or ideological or affiliational borders. And that it's those many, 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 many types of exchange that also make capitalism not only an effective system for increasing wealth, but also a fundamentally moral one that makes people better and better off.
A friend of mine put it in a way that I thought really rang true, which was, capitalism is the only moral system because it's the only one in which you have to give before you can receive. So I have to find, if I'm gonna go to the ice cream store and have that money, I had to do something for someone else, if I'm being honest, instead of just being a crook, to have that money in the first place. So it's a chain of it's fundamentally like a chain of serving others all the way down, if there's no fraud or theft involved, right?
Well, and that if is big, right? So I think a lot of things that people think they hate about capitalism are actually things they hate about government, because there is so much government incentivized or government facilitated theft that's occurring even in countries like our own that we might call a capitalist country. So it can be very easy to see that stuff and be like, well, this is endemic to capitalism. Like, there will always be, if there's capitalism, there will always be cronies. And I would say, well, if there's government, there'll always be cronies. You know, but these two systems do exist. You know, we do not live in an anarchic capitalist society. Neither does Argentina yet, although Javier Milei might get them there. It's unclear.
Yeah.
We live in a capitalist society that also has a quite robust state that is prone to all manner of disruptions to the market. And I don't want to say, you know, true capitalism has never been tried, because that way lies madness. But I do think, you know, I think the insight that like failed capitalism or imperfect capitalism has, you know, lifted 1 billion people out of poverty, and imperfect communism has more or less done the opposite. To me, that's a very, very powerful argument. Even if you screw it up, it still goes quite well for everyone, all told, is an important argument in favor of a system, I think.
This is one of the things that's so interesting about when you debate this subject of which it gets ideological very, very quickly and inherently, I think, but it is a spectrum. And it seems like the spectrum analysis has been done pretty much across the board. This is the part that I struggle with so much. And maybe I'm just turning into like a grumpy middle-aged man. But it's like, we tried being closer to communism than to laissez-faire everywhere on earth for a long time. And it was always murderous and awful every time. So why do you think that there's this romance that continues to exist, especially, you know, Milton Friedman said the only in the aftermath of the fall of the Soviet Union that the only place you can still find Marxists are on American universities. It seems like it's bleeding back out again. Is it just the perennial problem? Like, why does this remain an alluring proposition for so many people? Is it just like teenage punk radical nonsense? Like, what's going on here?
No, I think it's the flip side. It's the true communism has never been tried. Like, I am so, so, so sympathetic to people who can see in their minds, in their theory, a perfect version of the thing they want. And they are mad that in the real world, it's been screwed up by powerful men with bad intentions, broadly speaking. And I think that this is why we have to kind of do this eternally. But it's not just teenage punks, right? Like, there are
No,
plenty of
it's
grumpy
not.
middle-aged dads who are secret communists, for sure. There are plenty of people who would consider, as I say, the arguments that I just made about cronyism to be the exact same thing. Oh yeah, sure, your perfect version wouldn't have that. Okay, lady. So I think this desire to try the thing that you want for real and sort of have this dream, it's never going to go away. It's universal. I also do think, I mean, 200 years ago, the world was overtaken by a genuinely new idea. Like, this kind of enlightenment capitalism that swept through the globe was a radical break from everything that came before it. And I think that it's instilled in us, I mean, in terms of human scale time, that's a very recent occurrence. And
Mm-hmm.
it's instilled in us this idea that that could happen again. I could be the one with the idea that's going to change everything again. And that's probably good. That's probably good for us. You know, do I think that the idea that's going to change everything again is finally getting communism right? Absolutely not. Hard no. But I get that that might be a dream people have.
Um, the it seems like we were in some honeymoon period post collapse of the Soviet Union in which there was a fairly big shared center. Republicans, Democrats, left, right. By today's standards, like the Clinton of the 90s would be like a ultra conservative Republican in the eyes of a large percentage of the current Democratic Party. And that shared consensus did seem to be around the idea that, okay, capitalism works. Liberal democratic capitalism, if you want to load a bunch of descriptors into one thing. That's the end of history. We did it. We figured it out. If you call, if you were to call a Democrat a socialist, they would seem to take honest umbrage and say you were slandering them. It didn't take that long for that to, is it like generational? Why do you think we've like that? Why does that feel like the before times now, in your view?
It absolutely does feel like the before times. I mean, I joke that I went to college at the end of history because I did, right? I was in college from 1998 to 2002. So
Yeah.
there was nothing. Like, people on my campus were mad that there was nothing to protest for real. And I think, there are enough people for whom that feels like a recent memory, even though, let's be real, between us, it was a long time ago. Um,
Right. I know. There's that
it
too.
it it
It's
feels
25
like,
years. It's like, oh God.
yeah, yeah, it's upsetting. But it feels like, hey, we were just there. We can get back there, right? Um, and I think it's pretty clear that that was the anomaly, right? Like, that wasn't the natural state. That was the anomaly. But even then, we were papering over a lot of differences. And, I think it's worth noting that those differences were papered over in large part by prosperity.
Yeah.
And by the sense that we might be in a place where previous limits on growth were lifting, or that the kind of rules of the game for how rich we as individuals and as a society could be were changing. I think that's really worth keeping in mind. I actually was just editing a piece earlier today that's going to be in an upcoming issue of Reason, and the draft headline is "How Inflation Breaks People's Brains," and it's specifically about the ways in which, the social conditions that we were talking about earlier, of kind of lack of trust, and particularly distrust of the elites, and the ways that that manifests, that often happens in times when people start to feel that their money is not worth what it was. Um, that period of agreement and relative bipartisan peace was also a time when people felt like their money was really moneying real hard.
Right. Right.
And
This
I
was called the
think,
Great Moderation by macroeconomists.
right. But you don't think the money was moneying real hard is a good way to describe that?
I had to geek
Um,
out there. But yeah. No, it was, yeah.
so
Relative
it's not a
stability,
coincidence, right?
Alan Greenspan speak, all of that.
Yeah. And I think when people feel not only wealthy, but feel that there's headroom, that they're going to get wealthier, um, that can paper over an awful lot of disagreement. And so I'm sympathetic to people who say, well, we're going to grow our way out of this. Or, the kind of like techno optimists, like the Mark Andreessen types, who say, it's as long as we kind of keep the steady clip of new tech, we can keep our freedoms, basically,
Right.
that they kind of validate each other. I think that is true to a large extent, at least as a matter of fact.
It does seem like you've probably come across this. So John Maynard Keynes in it was a 1920 book, the economic consequences of the peace, talks about how insidious inflation is in a really eloquent way for being a guy that ends up promoting inflationary policy. It basically is like not one in 1,000 men will understand why or how this sort of scourge is turning everything upside down. And so you end up with the situation where there's all kinds of corrupt seeming winners and losers, and it undermines. In fact, I believe he even quotes Lenin saying that the fastest way to undermine a nation is to debauch the currency and inflate the currency. So again, it is another like 2021, 2022 mirroring 1970
Yep,
thing.
absolutely.
Um the what are some of the other challenges to a libertarian consensus, or a sense of like, because there was almost a kind of libertarian consensus when we were in college and graduating college. You know, neoliberalism wasn't pejorative. It was a term to be like, no, we all agree markets, private property, free trade, these are good. And
Yeah.
and now, there's a fairly substantial contingent of people who are conservative who would say, no, actually, we need to bend our institutions towards some notion of the common good. that, if the left is going to take over the schools and the state and bash us with it, we got to take control to do the same. That maybe that's not entirely a fair characterization, but there's definitely not a lot of love for free trade or free movement of people right now. So how do you think about that, and the how far away from we are to a libertarian moment?
So I actually love the some of these folks that you're describing, these conservatives who have kind of turned against the libertarian leg of the stool, if you want to use the kind of Reaganite approach. A lot of them say some version of like the libertarians have been in charge for too long. And
Where do they get this from?
yeah, like I don't really feel like I was in charge at all, much less for too long. And I think, there's a laughable sort of response. There's a laughing response to that claim, but I've actually sort of reconceived it a little in exactly the way that you just described. Actually, the libertarians kind of were in charge for a long time if you frame it as this broad-based neoliberal consensus, which,
Yeah,
didn't
right.
come out of the libertarian movement in a very explicit way. But certainly, this is the Milton Friedman line about, in a crisis, people will look around for the ideas that are laying around. And I do think that libertarians kind of left those ideas laying around, or maybe classical liberals, if you will,
Sure.
left those ideas laying around, and a bunch of them got seized upon and implemented to excellent effect. So I actually have decided to kind of like take the compliment from the NatCons or the common good conservatives or whatever they want to call themselves and
Or Joe
say like,
Stiglitz, which they end up sounding a lot too much
right.
like each other to.
Right. So, I mean, the horseshoe of it all, like when Tucker Carlson and Elizabeth Warren started sounding exactly the same on free trade, I really did have this moment of like, what am I even doing here? Like, I'm retiring to the country. I can't do this anymore. But you know, in that sense, libertarians were in charge for a long time. And I think the world was sort of uncontroversially better for it, or I guess somewhat controversially better for it. There are certainly people who would say that that was also a period of increasing inequality and exploitation of labor and all these kinds of things. So, you know, again, I have this sense of like that wasn't so long ago. That we could go back, and I do think that our partisan politics in this country are so dramatically influencing the way that people answer questions about their views on these big picture issues that it's really hard to know what people really believe. I mean, we saw polling on free trade and immigration flip, just exact inversion of Republican and Democratic responses to pollsters on those two issues when the administration flipped. And I would expect to see it again if it flips back. People just answer pollsters in a way that suggests, hey, I just want to express solidarity with my guy, with my team, with the person I voted for and are now psychologically committed um, to me, that's mostly terrible news because it means people don't really believe anything and have no idea what to think. But it also does mean minds can be changed. Like we can reset a status quo. We can reset a consensus if we hit it right.
I love your optimism. um, one of the things that is profound is is the impacts of these major technological shifts. And you are a media person, and media has gone through really radically profound changes. Um, how do you like? What's your sense of what media is doing to us as a people right now? I know that's like a really wide question, but there is um that is happening. There is something changing about the way we come to know things because of the technology, because of the incentives of engagement. How do you think about the landscape here?
So first, I guess I would say media doesn't do things to people. Media is a thing we do to ourselves, right? Like
Fair.
the media is made of people. It's like Soylent Green, right? Like, and I think that I think that's really important to keep in mind, because that is more true than it's ever been, right? There are more people who might be described as members of the media now than ever, by like a many, many, many orders of magnitude, right? And so I think there is, what you were going to see is that the pathologies of the media are just all human pathologies once the set of people who count as media gets large enough. It's just, the media is bad in the way that people are bad. And people are pretty bad. I mean, I think that's one thing that's worth keeping in mind, is like, people are good, but people are also very bad. And, all you need to do is spend an hour on Twitter. All you need to do is, spend an hour at a PTA meeting. All you have to do is spend an
Yeah.
hour in the grocery store, right? I mean, people are not behaving uniquely badly in their kind of written or video forms. We just are how we are. And so I think there's this illusion that at some point the media, the gatekeepers, the kind of the elite of the press were public servants, and they were doing more good than harm. And now it's just a mess and it's all scrappy. And I just don't think that story is true. I'm not saying that that's the claim that you're asserting, but I think a lot of people do have this declinist narrative that, among other things, ignores how catastrophically messy the media was during the founding era, for example, right? I
Right.
mean, it
Just
was just
yellow
like,
journalism.
Tuesday, let's accuse our political rivals of having mistresses. Like, Wednesday, let's accuse our political rivals of stealing money. We will not be retracting this. We will not be fact checking it. We're off to press. And I think that's, again, I kind of think like that's the norm. And we had this anomalous period, this kind of mid-century voice of God media. And, there's probably something to be said for not airing all of our dirty laundry all of the time in a maximally public forum. But it doesn't mean the laundry wasn't dirty before. It was always there.
I think the thing that I was using media in a slightly broader sense to include the fact that we now have um, a level of personalization of the experience of the world
Mm.
that is a technological shift. In fact, I saw a TikTok recently where the same video post, it was a girl who showed, look at the comments I'm seeing on this post. Now look at what my
Yeah, I've seen
boyfriend
that.
is seeing. Like, so even the comments were diametrically opposed. It was like it was a controversial video. I don't even remember the subject, but she was seeing either the positive or the negative comments, and he was seeing the opposite. And that's not some genie we can put back in the bottle, but it's changing the incentives of the business that you and I have chosen in really difficult ways if you care about trying to get ideas that you see as moral out into the world to people other than those who already love everything about what you're talking about. And so how do you think about that problem in particular? The sort
Yeah,
of
so I do think people get better at media literacy, right? I mean, there is a long, long, long story of people getting quite rapidly much better at seeing through various kind of tricks, including algorithmic manipulation, including, I mean, it goes back to sort of very, very early, photo manipulation, right? I mean, I guess like Arthur Conan Doyle wasn't smart enough to know that somebody had just drawn fairies onto that photo. And so he thought fairies were real, but like pretty much everyone else was like, oh, okay, you can doctor photos. We get it. We won't trust photographic evidence implicitly. And you have the kind of, the urban legend of like people hearing War of the Worlds and panicking on the radio because maybe it was true. I do think people's media literacy continues to grow, not quite on pace with the trickery of media itself, of course, and that's part of the problem. But at Reason we got into video very early.
Yep.
Reason TV has been around for ages and ages, and more recently, like everyone, we've kind of gotten onto TikTok and Instagram and all that. And one thing that I've actually come to realize is we only ever had 90 seconds with our consumers. And we could see that in our web analytics. We could see that that when you think about, you pick up a magazine,
Right.
are you close reading every word of that magazine, or are you kind of paging through it? You're looking at the headlines, you're looking at the pictures, you're soaking it up. Um, Certainly that's how people interact with our stories at reason.com. And, we see it with our videos. People watch the beginning of a video. And so on social media, one thing that we've realized is like, oh, we're going to make the whole point. Like, at least they're going to hear the conclusion
Yeah.
too in that 90 seconds, in that 2 minutes. So I think sometimes something that can look like decline, like, oh my God, people used to read magazine feature articles and now they look at 90-second TikToks. Maybe it's just realism. Maybe we only ever had those 90 seconds and we're just getting better at it. That's a very Pollyanna-ish view, I will grant you. But people also do still read the whole article. Like, people really do watch.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm sure on your channel you see this.
Yeah.
People will get all the way to the end of this video. And
Anywhere from like 10% to 30%. Sometimes shockingly, it's like, oh my God, that's 2 hours. How are 20% of people still watching to the end of 2 hours? It's kind of amazing.
right. And so I do think, there's when you think about the shape of the curve, like they're going to be the 90-second people and they're going to be the 90-minute people. And so I think that that's at least some cause for, well, let's think about how to talk to those audiences in ways that they can hear and want to hear. If you are, as Reason is, kind of a mission-driven media organization, then our mission isn't make people eat their broccoli and read 4,000 words about healthcare policy. Our mission is give people stuff they might be interested in to help them shape their worldview and think about stories that are undercovered and see the world through the lens of free minds and free markets. And we can do all that in whatever form is available to us if we're willing. Sometimes are people just going to watch makeup tutorials instead? Yeah, but they were always going to do that. The New York Times has always had a crossword and sports pages. Like, people like some trash with their news. They like some trash with their philosophy, and that's okay. That's how we are.
Julian Assange, after being in this limbo state, has managed to plea his way to what I guess is freedom. I don't have a full understanding of the story right now. My understanding is that he's made a deal such that the time he's spent in a kind of lockdown is now time served, and he gets to go home, I guess, to Australia and live as a free man. How closely have you followed this? I mean, it's the persecution of Julian Assange seems like a real Rorschach test for how to think about who is and isn't a journalist and what is and isn't journalism in the age of the internet. So how do you understand who Julian Assange was and what he means for your enterprise of journalism?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's not a coincidence that libertarians really took up his cause and were kind of early and loud in taking up his cause because I think at the very basic level, one of the things that what are journalists for? And it's to get out the truth, to expose the truth. And, if there's one thing that Assange has not been accused of, it's untruths, right? He is not peddling untruths. He is peddling real documents, real information. And in the end, it's just, to me, very hard to establish a moral high ground where you're like, people shouldn't know true things about what their government is doing. Like,
Right.
yeah, there might be bad consequences sometimes when the truth gets out, but not as often as defenders of kind of secrecy and noble lies and national security state would like us to believe. And far more often, good things happen when people know what's true. And I think, there's no point in being in journalism. There's no point in even thinking about who counts as a journalist unless you're going to grant that on some level. And I think the same thing is true of Chelsea Manning's case. I think, there's Assange is not the only one. He just happens to be very high profile and international and all that. But there are lots of people who have taken risks to expose true things. And I think, well, fundamentally, I don't think journalists should have different speech rights than anyone else. Like, we should all have the same free speech rights and they should be wide ranging and robust.
Yeah.
But certainly Assange should be accorded whatever rights are available for doing this thing, which is just like spreading true information.
For those who haven't, myself included, don't remember all the details of what the WikiLeaks leaks were, just can you recap uh, what it is that got Julian Assange into hot water with global governments and with the U.S. government in particular? Like, what exactly did he do that warranted being holed up in house arrest and foreign embassies?
I mean, I think it's easy, it's been so long and it's easy to forget like the wiki and WikiLeaks is relevant, right? So like we all use Wikipedia, we use it all the time, and it's crowdsourced, right? Many people contribute, and the idea there again is to get to the truth. What Assange did was build a way for people who have confidential information or information that governments want to keep secret in whatever form, or corporations, um, to make it available to the public in a kind of searchable, intelligible, usable way. Um, that's a great way to just like annoy a lot of governments. And I think at the very kind of root of it, that's all he was doing. I mean, he's a clearinghouse, right? He wasn't even he's not Glenn Greenwald, or he's not doing the journalism himself even. He was just bringing stuff to light. And I think people who would like to draw a distinction somehow of either how really, really secret those sources were originally, and also how much they were sort of laundered by WikiLeaks or by Assange. Like, is it okay if you like write some very nice prose about it, or if you just dump it? Like, is that really a difference? I don't think so. Um, Journalists all the time will defend their right to obtain sources, to obtain information from people, and not necessarily ask questions about how they got that information, right? I mean, this is the Pentagon Papers. This is,
Right.
there's a long tradition of, I'm not going to ask you how you got these documents, but I am within my rights to publish them. And that's a well-established principle.
I mean, it's not just like a journalism tradition. It is like the most lionized thing ever about journalism, right? The amount of movies about bringing things to light through the Washington Post is, the Oscar-winning performances about doing exactly a thing, more or less, that Julian Assange has been tormented about for
Right. And
however
just,
long it's been.
just because you happen to have a press pass in your hat before you do that, it doesn't mean that your rights should be different, I think. I will say journalists really drink that Kool-Aid. Like, I occasionally have to kind of talk down my reporters from like, I've gotten some documents, and it's like, is there anything in the documents? And they're like, but I got documents, and that's what we're supposed to do, right? And it's like, definitely yes. But also there has to be something in them. And I think, the innovation of WikiLeaks is that they kind of let the world decide, is there something in these documents, right? They kind of put them all out there. And in that way eliminated another gatekeeper. The media itself can be a gatekeeper in what they choose to tell you about what they get a hold of. And WikiLeaks just said, here, we got this for you. Do what you want.
The one of the things that I don't feel like sort of cosmopolitan libertarians, I'll say, and I would put myself in this category, spend a whole lot of time on, in my experience of it, is this notion of the elite. Like the notion that there is actually a kind of like shared cultural, you could even say class thing going on, such that there's a bunch of us living in a bubble that are seeing the world in a way that is a kind of colored glasses that's very different from a lot of other people. Probably the closest you'd come to something that informed me is Charles Murray's book Coming Apart. And he talks about how, you have essentially this cognitive urban elite that live in what he calls super zip codes, clusters of zip codes in which you can basically, all the Starbucks sippers all live together. Have you grappled with this? This is a big part of our discourse now, the sort of rise of a kind of us versus them populism. And I don't really say populism to degrade that view at all. But how do you think about this? Because it's in the ether. It's part of the reality of what we're navigating. And I don't know how to think about our shared philosophy in that context.
Yeah, I mean, when I remember when Coming Apart came out, and Murray had like a quiz you could take to see how far in your own bubble you are, essentially. And let's just say my score was embarrassing. Like, I am
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
absolutely part of the problem that he's describing. Um, and it is a problem. I think that there really is something important about, at the very least, keeping in your frame of reference and understanding that there is this separation and that it might be growing. Because I think you can see it playing out in kind of every ideology. You know, the Democratic Party trying to decide whether it's the party of kind of university educated coastal dwellers, or a thing that it has had a chance to be and has been, which is like the party of, blacks and Hispanics in this country, the party of, unionized workers, the party. There's a bunch of versions of itself that it can be, and the college educated coastal elite piece of it
Seems to
almost can't
dominate.
even see the other pieces, right? Like, they kind of know they're there, but they can't. It's almost invisible. And similarly, I think the rise of Trump is at least partially explained by the fact that DC conservative intellectual elites lost sight of who was really in the bulk of the party and what they wanted, and it wasn't, frankly, a revival of Frank Meyer's fusionism. It wasn't Ronald Reagan again. It was something else. And they couldn't see it. They couldn't see. They were squinting, but they couldn't see it. And they were looking at polls, but like they didn't, and I think libertarians have this too. And, I think there's the I read Hayek and I became a libertarians. And then there's the, uh, I just want to be left alone and I want to own some cool guns and I don't want to pay a lot of taxes, libertarians.
I kind of
And
I straddle both of those to some extent, especially having lived in Texas for over a decade. Although I probably lean, I don't know. I've found myself shifting from the I read Hayek to the I feel like I don't own enough guns over time.
right. And in fact, like all of there's bleed in all of these two categories, and there are many other categories as well. But I think, it can be very easy to lose sight of, who who else is in your coalition, and that is sort of been shown over and over to be quite damaging. And ultimately, like, we're all still in the same coalition, which is like the United States of America. Like, I might like to see our a different social and political order, but um, as long as we're all here and we're all voting together and we're all part of the same polity, you can't actually not know what's going on with the rest of the country, or things are going to get really, really messy. I do think, there's libertarians have a slight advantage here because they at least have a kind of um, intellectual story about why elites should be watched carefully.
Yeah.
And so do other ideologies. But I think the libertarian story is more actively embraced by the intellectual elite itself in a way that's hopefully provides a little bit of humility on that front.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned Hayek, and it's like the road to serfdom is, well, all of his work, but the chapter Why the Worst Get on Top is just an indictment of the fact that if you have a hierarchical power structure, you're going to end up with the mustache guys that slit throats at the top of it because the reward is so great that sociopathy ends up being a useful tool. This is a shorthand for
Yeah.
that. Um,
Well, and Hayek has his pyramid, in which he talks about the kind of dissemination of ideas. And I have always conceived of my role as a journalist to very much be the slice of the pyramid that's the popularizers, the secondhand dealers in ideas.
yeah.
I think that understanding yourself to be in that place as part of the media is so important, because it's different than, am I the source of truth? Am I the haver of the idea? Well, sometimes I'd like to think I have a decent idea, but I am in the middle here, and I'm just doing my best to bridge what is undeniably a huge gap between elites and everybody else.
Um, you are a mom. How old are your kids?
I have a 13-year-old girl and a 10-year-old boy.
So are you in the eye of a storm with your daughter being 13 or what?
So far, so good. She is
Oh,
at sleepaway camp right now, and I just got a little note saying that one of the activities she chose was rifle. So I'm feeling pretty good about it.
yes. How do you engage your kids um so that they can not have the problems that have befallen some of their peers? Like, do you have a philosophy of parenting that meshes with your worldview?
So a couple things there. The first is Reason publishes, and I personally adore Lenore Skenazy, who
Yeah.
is America's free range mom, and I think her ideas are so important.
Mhm.
Just really, the insight that kids need to have liberty to be virtuous, right? It's right back to the same thing. They have to be able to make mistakes, they have to be able to try stuff, they have to have autonomy, they have to have independence, you have to treat them as individuals, and you do it in an age appropriate way, but that probably as a society we've skewed too far toward kind of safetyism and collectivism in ways that you should be vigilant for. My kids attend an Acton, they attend two different schools built on the Acton Academy model. And
Mine too.
so that, that, that means that Lenore is part of the curriculum there, and that they do mastery-based learning. They do mastery-based learning. They do, no homework except for when work needs to be done at home. And that they have kind of a note in there of like entrepreneurship, which I really, really like. Um, all that said, my husband and I are both libertarians, and none of our parents were. So we understand that as we have rebelled, so our children will probably rebel. We have like long predicted that one of our children will figure out that the maximum rebellion that they could do would be to be both kind of socialist, communist, and religious. And so that probably means we're going to end up with a kid on a kibbutz, like real quick. My husband is Jewish, and so that is the maximum possible rebellion, I think, in from a kind of ideological perspective. It happens, right? Like part of the package of treating kids as individuals and trusting them to make their own decisions is they might decide not to be libertarians, and that's okay. Certainly, that happened to my parents, and my mom has only recently stopped hoping that this is a phase.
The One of the things, Lenore had a huge impact on me, as did Jonathan Haidt and the book The Coddling of the American Mind. I mean, I like 5 years ago, my son was at Acton. He's graduated now, but the sense in which this was the bit of the shiver of terror that went down my spine. The sense in which I don't see how you keep a free society if you don't have a public that wants to be free for themselves, that feels the joy of mastery, that is willing to take risks because they've taken risks in their life and know that when it works out, it's the greatest feeling in the world when you try something you don't think you can do and then you turn out you can do it. And so, you know, it do you see it the same way that this the culture of parenting is as pivotal for the future as I think it is? I mean, I think it's like it makes sense that you would publish Lenore in Reason, because I don't see how you can raise kids to only ever look for the authority figure to tell them what to do next and to clear the path for them. I I saw one poll recently, and this is like a 2x increase from a prior poll. Some 800 employers were surveyed, and 1 in 5 new employees brought a parent to the job interview. it's like it's like, who's this old guy coming in the door? Oh, it's my dad. Okay, well, this interview's done. Thanks for coming, but I don't even need to say another word to you. So how do you think about this generational thing and what we as like Gen Xers, what role do we have in raising a generation of like nervous commies?
Yeah, I mean, it absolutely will be our fault if that's what you're asking. Yes. But I think more broadly, I do think these things tend to be pendulums, right? And not just this specific question of kind of helicopter versus latchkey, but so many cultural things. You know, white bread, brown bread, natural, technological, they're urban, suburban. Like there are just so many places where the pendulum is always swinging. So I think there is this phenomenon where like either we raise our kids right and in a sensible way, or we screw it up so bad that they rebel and raise their kids the opposite way. So it's gonna work out either way. That's one way to think about it. I do also think that I'm entering this phase now where you realize as a parent that peer influence is so much more important than
Yes.
anything that you can say.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one thing that we do, can and should do is really be super thoughtful about who our kids' peers are. You can't control that ultimately. Like their peers are ultimately everyone in the whole wide world, but it absolutely is appropriate as a parent to choose that when they're younger, and also not just their real peers, but their parasocial peers, right? Like what are they seeing online and who do they identify with online? And I think, my daughter doesn't have a phone, and
That was going to be my
it's
next question: is how do you interact with monitoring social media and digital
yeah.
access for your kids?
So I actually also love Jonathan Haidt. I have parted ways with him. Reason has parted ways with him somewhat on his most recent book. I think, his willingness to say, this time it's different, it's time to get the state involved, makes me awful nervous.
Yeah, thumbs down on that.
But I think his general insights are very, very good. And of course, in line with Lenore Skenazy. And, I'm the parent. I'm the one, and there are limits to your parent's influence, but one thing that you absolutely can do is like, I'm not going to buy you a phone. That's like a thing you can do. I am not particularly, as you might have guessed from this entire conversation, apocalyptically worried about social media. But my son has has a much more active online life than my daughter does. He just loves to watch 4-hour long Zelda
Yeah.
run throughs. This is his life, and to take it away from him would be beyond cruelty, and I'm not going to do it. But um but there still are lots and lots of reasonable ways to limit the ways that your kids interact with technology. As at the Acton Academies, they learn math from Salman Khan, and that's the internet too. And I think that
Right.
this sort of fear of screen time or the internet broadly is so misplaced, because the internet is also where understanding algebra lives. Because I can tell you where it doesn't live, and that's in my house. Like I'm not going to be able to do as good a job as Sal Khan can do. I want him to teach them, and and likewise with so much of the rest of their curriculum, there are things that the internet will do best, and I want my kids to have access to that. I think they are beyond lucky to have been born when they were born, and yeah, I want to keep an eye on them not falling down some kind of ridiculous TikTok rabbit hole, but I have every tool in the world to do that, including all kinds of parental controls that are very, very easy to use on every kind of device. And I think people really underestimate the state of the technology there. Like, I don't know why we think Josh Hawley has to do this. I can do this on the Nintendo myself.
As we start to come to a close, although I wish we could have this be a 4-hour conversation just for my own enjoyment. Uh, what would you say is the hardest thing about being an optimist? Because where even if we might disagree in some narrow areas around whether it's faith or how crooked and fallen we may or may not be as a creature. I'm maybe it's a little more. I think we might be a little more fallen and crooked than you think we are, but that's okay. By and large, the overlap's 98%. Um, it is really friggin' hard to convince anyone that things are going pretty good, or even the fact that there is no other time where you would rather be born than right now. It is like the hardest message to put into the world and be accepted by just about anybody. So how do you agree with that statement? And B, what do we do about that?
Yeah, there is this very weird quirk that seems quite universal in human psychology, where if you say, hey, actually things are pretty good. Here's a bunch of evidence. People are like furious, like very, very angry at you to have brought them this good news. And, of course, it's easy to understand why, right? Like you say, hey, 90% of people have access to clean drinking water, and they hear, I reject that your suffering matters.
Yes.
And I think that gap is the hardest thing to bridge. It's how do you talk about what's good without having people hear, and understandably hear,
Quit complaining.
I yeah, quit complaining. I reject your complaints, the truth value even of your specific complaints. Um, because it's very clearly extremely culturally toxic to believe that we're in the apocalypse, right? You see this from everything from childbearing rates to
Yep.
just, as you say, mental health. The kind of belief that the state of the world is in the garbage is a great way to hurry getting the state of the world into the garbage. And so I
Yes.
think it is so important and so difficult to take that idea and flip it and kind of bring people into a more optimistic place. Um, the thing I don't find hard is like, I'm pretty sure that we're just stuff. I'm pretty sure that when we die, we're just dead. I'm pretty sure on kind of the macro level, there is no big why. To me, it's very easy to be cheerful in the face of that because even if we're just stuff, this stuff is very cool. Like humans, even if we are just meat sacks, have done some very, very cool stuff. And, to me, there's just so much there to be excited about and optimistic about. So I think, the hard part about being an optimist is finding connection, but actually, maybe that's just the hard part about being a human.
Um, I think that is a great place to bring us to a close. So I have a final question for you. I ask this of every guest, and we call this show "Dad Saves America" because, as we've talked about Lenore and about parenting, I believe as a man that being a father, and I think as a woman being a parent, is really one of the most heroic things we can do for the world, to create life, to raise them, hopefully with values that will serve them well after we die. And that is the definition of impact. It's the role we can embrace. Not everybody, but I think most people. How do you see your role in the American story?
So, one thing that I used to talk about a lot when I first started out in the libertarian movement is, people kept putting me on panels that were like, hey, how come there aren't that many libertarian women? Right? Like, I must have been on a
Yeah,
hundred panels
fair
that
question.
were, how come there aren't that many libertarian women? Um, First of all, there are a whole lot more women now than
Yeah.
there used to be. I mean, I no longer get invited to do those panels because there are plenty of women to put on them, and sometimes they don't even have them anymore. So, huge victory. Um, but I used to sometimes joke, well, like, I think we might just need to make more. Like, we might just need to have kids and raise them libertarian, and it's 50-50 that they're going to be girls, right? So let's just do it. So I agree with you that parenting is really one of the kind of coolest and most interesting things that you can do. I think it is a way to change the world. The people you make become the people of the future. But I also think, um, one thing that I hope that Reason does every day is create a kind of found identity, or even though this is very, very cheesy, I will say it, kind of a found family for people who do have these libertarian instincts and feel lonely. Because I think, um, when people encounter Reason, very, very often, they don't say, oh, you argued me into changing my mind. They say,
Yeah.
I always thought these things, and now I see how to describe it. Now I see that other people think them too. Now I found this sense of belonging. And so, I would like to think that one thing that I am doing in the world and that Reason is doing in the world is maybe kind of making that found family for some people, and hopefully for young people and young women in particular. Come on in. I'm happy to have you at the party, and I think we can keep doing that because there's still so many people out there who I think share libertarian instincts and just haven't found a way to think or talk about it.
Katherine, thanks for being on Dad Saves America. It's been a lot of fun.
It was a pleasure. Thank you for having me.